Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. When Indians look at China, they see a country that's an economic superpower, that's a military giant, that's a country that perhaps will be, if not a rival, then certainly a challenge to India in the region, in Asia and the world. But how often do they think of China as a country pursuing environmental and energy policies that adversely affect us here, the wider South Asian region, and in fact, the rest of Asia? Joining me to discuss China's environmental and energy policies and how this impacts on the world at large is one of America's leading scholars on China, Chinese energy, Chinese environmental policy, Dr. Jennifer Turner. Welcome to Indian Standard Time and Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you for having me.
You are, of course, director of the China Environmental Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. You've written extensively, you've spoken extensively on Chinese environmental policies. Prime Minister Narendra Modi will visit Beijing and Xi'an next week. And, of course, the border issue and trade issues will dominate.
Yeah.
But over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a growing sense of unease in India as China has begun to take advantage of its position as an upper riparian. The major rivers of the subcontinent, of course, the Brahmaputra, but also the Indus, the Sutlej, the Mekong in Southeast Asia, the Salween for Myanmar, all originate in China. And the Chinese increasingly look like a country that wants to take advantage of the water flows, not always in a way that would protect the interests of the lower riparian. What do we know about China's plans to harness these rivers and to take advantage of its position as an upper riparian?
Well, in China, I mean, their energy hunger is great. I mean, since 2000, 2007, they doubled their electricity consumption, doubled it again since then, and on track to keep going. And while coal is king, hydropower is probably the queen in terms of energy in China. I mean, they have a lot of it, and they see it as this is actually a clean option to coal. And I mean, they have the largest number of hydropower dams of any country in the world. And so it's very much, their hydropower construction is very much focused internally. It's to solve a problem, to send that electricity to the coast, kind of end story. And then that even within the country, there's been challenges that the hydropower development is impacting, the rivers that don't even flow down south. I mean, the Yangtze River, and it's years ago we would have never thought that its flow could get too small, but it's also its flow is narrowed, making the pollution problems worse. So yeah, it's just like they need the power.
So in a sense, even hydro projects that don't have implications for China's neighbors, that entirely flow within China, haven't been planned properly from an environmental point of view, or
I think the
implications haven't been taken into account? Well,
there's sometimes competition that it's not always that the plans on the dams or that it's always just coming from the top. Provincial level governments also are in charge of building some of the dams, and so there's almost like a race, to dam up almost every gorge as fast as they can.
But rivers that have an interprovincial flow, surely the central government would try to ensure that the interests of all riparian provinces are protected. Do they not do that?
Not always, and there was also kind of a sad example where in the upper part of the Yangtze River where there was actually a nature reserve. And the Ministry of Environmental Protection was encouraged to move the boundary of the nature reserve so a dam could go in and fill up what really was supposed to be a protected area.
So you are now making me feel even more worried. If the Chinese central government doesn't bother to protect the interests of lower riparian provinces within China when thinking about riverine projects, what hope is there for lower riparian states like India, Bangladesh, Myanmar?
Well, I mean, I think it's been a big issue. I mean, in the Mekong River Basin Commission, China just has observer status, and they've really viewed it as they are the upper riparian and they need the energy. But at the same time, Chinese dam building companies are also building hydropower projects invited by the governments in Southeast Asia as well. And and this kind of this dam building boom or this domino of dams, it continues even into India. I mean, your own country also has had big goals for hydropower as being a clean energy.
Right. It seems that if we look at the fears of lower riparians like India or Bangladesh vis-a-vis the Brahmaputra, which originates in China, in Tibet, it seems that they're three kinds of projects we could look at or discuss. One would be what the Chinese say are simple run-of-the-river projects that don't involve too much of storage. Then there would be the more giant dams that require large storage and which would interrupt, say, the regularity of river flows or the quantum of water. The third are what I would call the Frankenstein projects, the projects to divert rivers from Western China or Southern China to other parts that are water stressed. What do we know in terms of Chinese planning? How far along are some of these ideas? Is there a real possibility that the Chinese may one day try to divert the flow of some of these rivers?
Well, I should let you know that China, everything in China is superlatives in terms of infrastructure. And China already has built 2 of the canals from the Yangtze River to the north. I mean, it's called the South-North Water Transfer Project. And now the final diversion, which would be far out west, which would be getting into Sichuan, getting closer and really into the Tibetan water tower, that project is going to take, it could take 10, 15, 20 years. And when we did some of our research looking into water energy nexus issues in China, we interviewed the chief engineer of the South-North Water Transfer Project, and we asked quite politely that, well, I mean, this diversion, it's going to take 15, 20 years, and it's very expensive. You have to blast through mountains. And he said, we must do this. This water diverts water to the Yellow River, and it's in the heart of a coal region that we haven't tapped, and China needs coal. So, water's being moved north to serve the cities, but also to serve the coal industry. So
far, the bulk of India's discussion on water issues with the Chinese side has revolved around or is limited to the sharing of data. I mean, there have been instances when landslides on the Chinese side have led to artificial lakes being created.
Exactly, and then they burst.
They burst, and there's obviously create problems in some of our northern provinces. And there's been some discussion on the sharing of data in such instances.
Which is progress.
Exactly.
This is real progress.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But if you consider the scale of the challenge that any large Chinese projects on the Yarling Tsangpo, which becomes the Brahmaputra, the impact this would have on us or Bangladesh, it's colossal. We clearly need to be doing more to discuss this with the Chinese. But tell me, as a group, you're not a lawyer, obviously. You're an environmental specialist. But what options do the lower riparians have? In this case, in South Asia, for example, India and Bangladesh would be affected by any projects on the Yarling Tsangpo. The Mekong Delta countries are there. Are there things that these countries could do to band together?
Well, I think that, what I've seen more, I'm more familiar with what's been happening in the Mekong River basement. I mean, there's been attempts to try to engage the Chinese and also working with actually the same companies that are building up in China are the ones that are building down in Southeast Asia. And there's been some environmental groups that also have been working with the Chinese Sino-Hydro, for example, about more sustainable hydropower protocol to making sure that the dams are done having social and environmental impact. And there appears to be some true interest within Sino-Hydro because they're not just in this region, they're going to Africa, they're going to other countries, and they're starting to become more concerned about their multinational kind of image. And that, it's a different kind of tact instead of talking to the Chinese government, but a state-owned enterprise that maybe it could be a long shot, but I think it's really intriguing to me that these kinds of conversations appear to be moving forward with the company.
Now, let's say a Chinese scholar or a Chinese government official were to watch our discussion and say, look, you are worried about hydroelectric projects. So let's say we agree to abandon some of these projects and we go to coal. The reason we did hydro projects was to save the world from global warming. So we're going to now. So obviously, the more coal-fired power projects there are in China, that's bad news too, right? I mean, there are negative externalities associated with that. Yeah. So that's not an option either.
No. I mean, China has already. Just last year in the U.S.-China Climate and Energy Agreement, China committed to an absolute peak of their coal. I mean, keep in mind this is a Himalayan peak. But it's still saying we have a number, and since that agreement, they've moved it more to 2025. Even some talk even 2020.
What's the breakdown in terms of their energy, in terms of different sources?
Well, right now, about 68% of their electricity comes from coal. Okay. I think it's more like 16% hydro. Well, basically, we'll say the other 30% wedge, you've got wind power, the largest installed wind power fleet in the world. Yeah. You've got solar. Nuclear, even though there's like 40 plants coming online, it's only going to be about 5% of their electricity. And what's not quite even a line yet is going to be is natural gas for electricity. Right. But that's also being seen as a potential game changer that could offer some hope, you know, for maybe the desire to keep building the hydro and the coal.
But coal is around 70% today.
It's about 68.
68%.
And last year, for the first time, coal consumption actually dropped by about 2%. And it's another encouraging sign. And they've been doing it in great part because their cities are covered in domes of air pollution.
So the smog and air pollution and the terrible air quality in Beijing and other places is a result of excessive use of coal for
mainly coal and cars. And the Chinese public is increasingly frustrated and angry about this. And now I know that, you know, I've been having some conversations here in India where they say, well, they don't elect their leaders. How can the public pressure them? And I say, well, there's social media, there's protests, there's also, you know, and businesses also, you know, international companies being less and less willing necessarily to invest in China. It's seen as kind of a high-risk environment with the air quality. So for both social stability and continued economic growth, they realize that, you know, they have to dethrone king coal.
But insofar as king coal remains ensconced for the foreseeable future,
still, it's
are they up to date in terms of the technologies used? You know, clean coal or modern plants, or are there gains to be harvested by technological change?
Well, they've been ripping down a lot of the smaller coal-fired power plants, and they have the world's largest fleet of supercritical and ultra supercritical coal-fired power plants that are 40% more efficient than actually a lot of coal-fired power plants that we have in the U.S. Our coal power plants are pretty old, need to be retired, so it is pretty clean. But they also are now trying to ramp up, you know, while they've been going like crazy on solar and wind in terms of these large farms, they're also starting to talk more about rooftop solar, kind of the decentralized, similar things that
right.
we've heard coming up here now in India.
Right. You mentioned pollution and the state of Chinese cities. There was recently a study, data released for Delhi, which is also a very polluted city, which I think the two numbers which stuck in my throat were that 40% of school-going kids have asthma or asthmatic symptoms. Yeah. And by the time you're 40 or 50, you have, even if you're not a smoker, you have the lungs, the average Delhi resident has the lungs of a smoker. Are there comparable studies done for Chinese cities which convey the enormous public health impact of pollution?
I mean, sadly, Chinese are, you know, kind of ahead of India on this to great detriment to the people of China. I mean, the estimates range. The Ministry of Health in China says that 500,000 people die early every year from respiratory illnesses linked to air pollution. World Bank and others say it's more like 1.2 million. Asthma, again, off the Richter scale. And we've seen that every winter when they have these peaks, you know, 800, you know, AQI of the particulate matter 2.5, that, I mean, hospitals are inundated with people. And cancer rates, I mean, well, the numbers are sometimes a bit dodgy. You don't know where they get them, but there's signs that just overall cancer rates are increasing in China. I mean, besides the air pollution, water pollution is also quite severe. Soil contamination. It's just, you know, there's a really scary litany of environmental health problems hitting China, and the public's scared.
You mentioned solar and wind, and China is one of those countries that actually allocates quite a large budget to
number one in the world
for
to
R&D, and they are often accused of dumping their products. So one could argue that the dumping of cheap solar panels is actually a positive externality because it allows the rest of the world to leapfrog, to move to clean energy faster.
And you should know that with solar panels, in terms of jobs, most of the jobs are created where they're installed. So while there's a lot of people getting upset about the dumping of cheap solar panels, it's creating more jobs in the countries where they get installed.
But for the foreseeable future, if solar and wind occupy, say, about 5 to 7% of the Chinese energy mix today, or is that
the goal is also part of the agreement. The goal is to get that up to closer to 20% of total electricity, but it's a growing pie.
Had they declared a national target before the Obama agreement? Yeah,
they had it in the 11th and 12th five-year plan that there was already a target by 2020 to have 20%
okay.
from wind and solar.
And as an energy analyst, is that a realistic target, given the current state of play?
I think it is, and particularly now that they're hitting some challenges in terms of the decentralized, like the rooftop solar, these kind of renewables, because while they can maybe get it on top of the building, some difficulties kind of selling power back to the grid.
Right.
But at the same time, I mean, in China, in terms of infrastructure, when they want to get it done, it can happen quite quickly. So it's, it'll be really interesting to see, I mean, if they're, for example, in terms of like solar, the storage.
Yeah.
There's lots of talk these days about the next breakthrough will be the kind of batteries.
Cell storage, exactly.
Cell storage, and that this, and as this technology comes closer to being real, I mean, the Chinese will be quick adopters. They're putting lots of money into this. And by putting the money in, and they have the policies to encourage clean energy development. And so that's actually attracted a lot of international companies. And just as a little side note, we've actually seen examples of Chinese clean energy companies partnering with US ones coming back and putting investment into the United States in these sectors.
So even if China's neighbors and the wider world have every right to feel worried about the negative externalities of hydro and coal, energy in China, the Chinese can say, look, we are trying to do our bit by creating new technologies in solar and wind?
Yeah, they're trying, and but also you have to keep in mind, here's another number, since we're playing ping pong with numbers here today, about 25% of China's electricity actually goes into products that are made for export.
Okay.
So that it's, so that we in the greater world...
So everybody's complicit actually in this.
We are complicit,
yeah,
and it's sometimes, but it's
you want your cheap Chinese goods, but you want to complain about about coal.
Yeah, but even thinking things like wood products are good. We have certifications for sustainable wood. Clothing manufacturers, where 50% of the clothing is made in China, big polluter of waterways, particularly in southern China. Trying to figure out, can the world have, can we link our consuming habits for clothes to pollution in China or other countries?
How central is nuclear to the Chinese future energy mix? Are they serious about it, or do they have reservations about future? I mean, is there a debate in China on the future environmental problems that this might cause, the long-term costs that we don't know about, particularly post-Fukushima?
Post-Fukushima, they hit the pause button for a while.
Okay.
And then,
everybody hit
the pause button.
Exactly, and then there were stress tests conducted and so on.
Yeah.
But since then, they've picked up speed.
They picked up. I mean, the thing is that for coastal China, that coastal China consumes 40% of their electricity. They want to keep the factories moving, the lights on in the cities, and so at a local level, the nuclear power can play a big role. But in the overall percentage,
I guess most of the coastal plants are coal plants. Or no?
Well, no. The nuclear power plants
are coming
on the coast.
Okay.
They're actually starting to move more and more of the coal-fired power plants further inland and using. They've got
so they're using their own coal then, I guess, not because.
Yeah, China. Their import. Overall, their imports of coal. I mean, India, 1/3 of your coal consumption is from imports. In China, it's just at 1 or 2 percentage points, if that.
Right.
But for nuclear power, they're constructing about 40, almost up to 50 nuclear power plants, and it's huge. But in terms of overall percentage, maybe it'll come up to 5% of their electricity needs by 2020. So it's a drop in the bucket, but for the certain areas where they're going to be placed, it'll be really important.
Let's talk about the agreement that President Xi and President Obama signed on the climate change deal, without getting into the minutiae of the global climate change debate.
Yeah.
How important do you rate that agreement, and what do you think its international implications are going to be?
Well, I think it's a very important agreement, and it's been building on. In 2009 they had some clean energy agreements, and have really started to increase the interaction on clean energy, and that's been a lot of the big focus between the two countries. But now with the climate agreement, the fact that both countries both have committed to a solid number, it's now the U.S. is no longer China's biggest excuse, and vice versa, not to act. And in general, we've seen that this is changing the conversation at the global talks. And I know there's still going to be a lot of wrestling matches. Can you trust what they're going to do? But the Chinese government, I mean, for many years now, they have said they recognize that climate change is a problem. They've just last week, there were some announcements by high-level meteorological and other people in the government in China saying that climate change impacts are going to be severe in China.
Right.
I mean, already their water system is, they use and abuse water already badly, standard operating procedures. Climate change on top of that takes it to an even higher crisis level. So,
I know after that agreement there was some discussion and speculation about how India would factor into this. There was some talk of India coming under pressure to name a peaking year.
Yeah, and we did hear something.
Pun unintended.
Yeah.
but unlike the Chinese, who I presume have done fairly rigorous econometric modeling, so that they were in a position to project into the future.
I mean, China. I mean, in an international environmental agreement, I've never seen them come up with such solid numbers, and a lot of that is that they've been working with a lot of U.S. national labs. I mean,
But they've harvested the benefits of 10% growth for nearly
40 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in India, when the question is asked of analysts here, the response has always been that, well, we are simply not in that position. And I think when President Obama was here and there was some effort to discuss this issue, it was clear that no agreement of that nature would be possible immediately.
But India, I mean, it's almost like you guys were where China was 10 years ago. And I'm sure there are many people in China, as they look at their gray dome of smog that they're choking on, that said, why didn't we start 10 years ago? In terms of the renewables, and that there is an opportunity. The technology is there. And your grid, there's so many things that can be done.
No, I think there's a lot of concern. I think the Indian debate on climate change today is very different from what it was a decade ago. I think there's you don't meet climate skeptics in India, for example.
That's good to hear.
Unlike in the West, everybody is keen to act responsibly. But there's an international context, I suppose, and it's a tough negotiation. We'll see what happens in Paris. We don't have too much of time left, but you have been talking and writing a lot about what's called choke point.
Global choke point.
Global choke point. This sort of intersection of water, energy, and food security or insecurity. Is China approaching its choke points? Is it already there?
They're hitting the choke points. I've been very lucky in my work. I've been working with a group called Circle Blue, and we've done multimedia research in China, where we were looking at how's energy development impacting water. And big interest was coal, but also hydro. And we found out, gathering data. And again, they opened doors to us. It's really exciting doing this research that of all the water used in China, about at least 20% of it goes to the coal sector.
Right.
And that was a number that no one had really thought about. And I found that when we were going back and talking to the government and researchers, that now the Chinese government has started to regulate the coal sector in terms of their water consumption. And even in the most recent climate agreement, they've created, well, it's in process now, a U.S.-China water energy program. Because while we tend to think of coal as having a big air pollution problem, it's also an incredibly thirsty resource.
Right, exactly.
And most of the coal is in northern China, where there's very little water. And we produced the data and said, you don't have enough water to keep this kind of coal stuff going.
Hence the Frankenstein,
Frankenstein,
water divergent projects. But what about food? I mean, food production in China is not going to keep pace with their demand.
Well, with the growth, the cities, the energy sector, putting lots of pressure on the water, and we've actually seen that, in China that about a year and a half ago, the government finally admitted, we can't be food self-sufficient. And in fact, they have been importing a lot more grain over the past, 10, 15 years. And they really view it as, this is importing water. It's importing land. They are land and water constrained. And so, and that has also obviously global implications. The soybean, I don't know if you guys talk about soybeans much here in India, but in China, that because of the growing meat production, because they're getting wealthier, they're eating more pork, they need the soybeans. And so China has been driving global soybean production, which has the ripple effect of deforestation in Brazil.
All over Latin America, exactly.
All over Latin America.
Dr. Sana, it's been fascinating talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thanks for having me.
That's the end of this show. Do join us again next Friday for another episode of Indian Standard Time.